Welcome to another gentle journey through time, where we'll explore the hidden corners of history together in the soft embrace of twilight. Tonight, we're traveling back to the Renaissance, that golden age of art and learning, when the great cities of Italy glowed with candlelight and possibility. But we're not visiting the famous artists or powerful princes tonight. Instead, we're stepping quietly into the world of the courtesans, those remarkable women who moved through marble palaces and velvet chambers, carrying secrets that history has whispered about for centuries. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and settle into this story as we uncover the awkward, amusing, and surprisingly human moments from the lives of Renaissance Italy's most fascinating women. The word courtesan conjures images of silk and sophistication. But tonight you'll discover that beneath the glamorous surface, these women faced moments of delightful embarrassment, social blunders, and wonderfully human mishaps that make their stories feel surprisingly, intimately real. So close your eyes if you wish, let the modern world fade away, and join me as we slip through the shadows of 15th and 16th century Italy, where even the most elegant courtesans had their awkward moments. Picture, if you will, Venice in the year 1580. The morning sun filters through tall windows of a palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal, casting golden ribbons across marble floors. In a chamber draped with burgundy silk, a young woman named Veronica Franco, perhaps the most celebrated courtesan of her time, is experiencing a moment of profound mortification. Veronica had spent hours preparing for this particular morning. She was expecting Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, a man of immense power and exquisite taste. Her servants had arranged her auburn hair into an elaborate coiffure, adorned with pearls that caught the light like dewdrops. Her gown, a masterpiece of blue silk embroidered with silver threads, fit her like liquid starlight. But as she descended the grand staircase to greet her distinguished visitor, disaster struck in the most human way possible. Her elaborate headdress, heavy with jewels and pins, began to list precariously to one side. Like a ship taking on water, it slowly, inevitably, began its graceful descent toward the marble floor. Veronica froze, one delicate hand reaching helplessly toward her sliding coiffure, while Cardinal Farnese watched from below, his expression a mixture of concern and barely suppressed amusement. For a moment that felt like an eternity, time suspended itself as pearls scattered like raindrops and hairpins chimed against the stone steps. What followed was perhaps the most gracefully handled social disaster in Venetian history. Veronica, rather than flee in embarrassment, began to laugh. Her laughter bubbled up like champagne, infectious and genuine. The cardinal, charmed by her ability to find humor in mishap, joined her laughter, and what could have been a mortifying moment became the beginning of a friendship that would last decades. This scene, preserved in Veronica's own letters, reminds us that even the most accomplished women of the Renaissance faced the same delightfully human moments of awkwardness that we all experience. The difference, perhaps, lay in how they chose to navigate these moments. If you're finding peace in these gentle stories, feel free to subscribe or simply let yourself drift deeper into this world. The Renaissance courtesan was expected to be many things: a patron of the arts, a conversationalist of wit and learning, a muse to poets and painters. But perhaps most surprisingly, she was often a scholar in her own right. And with scholarship came the inevitable academic embarrassments that scholars have always endured. Let us visit the salon of Tullia d'Aragona in Rome, circa 1540. Tullia was renowned not just for her beauty, but for her philosophical treatises and poetry. Her weekly gatherings attracted the greatest minds of the age. Cardinals rubbed shoulders with poets, artists debated with philosophers, and Tullia presided over it all like a Renaissance queen. On this particular evening, the discussion had turned to platonic love, a fashionable topic among the intellectual elite. Tullia was holding forth on the nature of divine beauty, quoting extensively from Marsilio Ficino's translations of Plato. Her audience listened with rapt attention, hanging on every elegant phrase. Until, in the middle of a particularly sophisticated argument about the soul's ascent toward the divine, Tullia's mind went completely, absolutely blank. She stood there, one hand gracefully extended, her mouth half open, while Rome's most brilliant minds waited for the conclusion of her thought. The silence stretched like taffy, broken only by the gentle crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones. What saved the moment was Tullia's quick wit and the forgiving nature of Renaissance intellectual culture. She smiled, placed her hand over her heart, and declared that divine beauty had so overwhelmed her mortal faculties that she could only contemplate it in reverent silence. The assembled scholars, charmed by this elegant recovery, applauded her Platonic swoon, and the evening continued without missing a beat. But Tullia confided to her diary that night, in Latin no less, that she had been so nervous about impressing Cardinal Bembo with her erudition that her mind had simply abandoned her at the crucial moment. It's a feeling every student, every public speaker, every human being who has ever tried to appear more intelligent than they felt would recognize instantly. Food in Renaissance Italy was both art and theater. Elaborate banquets served multiple purposes, displaying wealth, cementing alliances, and providing opportunities for subtle social maneuvering. For courtesans, who often hosted such gatherings, the pressure to orchestrate perfect dining experiences could lead to moments of exquisite awkwardness. Isabella di Luna, a celebrated courtesan of Naples, learned this lesson memorably during the summer of 1565. She had invited a group of distinguished guests to sample a new delicacy that had recently arrived from the New World, something called a tomato. These strange red fruits were still exotic curiosities, viewed with suspicion by many who believed they might be poisonous. Isabella, ever the innovator, had convinced her cook to prepare them in a sauce for pasta, what we might recognize today as an early form of marinara. The dinner party was meant to be intimate and sophisticated, a chance for her guests to experience something truly novel. The evening began beautifully. Candles flickered in silver sconces, casting dancing shadows across the frescoed walls. The guests, including several prominent merchants and a visiting diplomat from France, were appropriately impressed by the novelty of the red sauce. But Isabella had not anticipated the digestive consequences of introducing an entirely new food to Renaissance palates. Within an hour of the meal, her carefully orchestrated soirée had descended into a series of increasingly urgent departures as her guests found themselves in need of immediate privacy. Isabella herself, having sampled the dish extensively to ensure it was safe for her guests, spent the remainder of the evening in decidedly unglamorous circumstances. Her elaborate silk gown, her carefully arranged coiffure, her reputation as a sophisticated hostess, all seemed rather beside the point as she dealt with the very human consequences of culinary innovation. The next morning brought a stream of apologetic messages from her guests, who had recovered their composure along with their digestion. The French diplomat, with characteristic gallantry, declared that he would forever associate tomatoes with the beautiful courage of Italian ladies. Isabella kept the letter, and in years to come, when tomatoes had become commonplace, she would read it and laugh at the memory of her most memorably awkward dinner party. Renaissance courtesans were expected to be accomplished performers, able to sing madrigals, recite poetry, and play musical instruments with skill and grace. But performance, by its very nature, carries the risk of very public failure. And when your livelihood depends on maintaining an image of effortless perfection, such failures can be particularly mortifying. Gaspara Stampa, the Venetian courtesan and poet who would later be celebrated as one of the finest lyric voices of her age, experienced one such moment during the carnival season of 1550. She had been invited to perform at a private gathering in the palazzo of a wealthy merchant. The audience included several influential patrons of the arts whose continued support was crucial to her career. Gaspara had chosen to perform one of her own compositions, a sonnet about the pain of unrequited love, set to a delicate melody she had written herself. The piece was deeply personal, drawn from her own tumultuous relationship with Count Colaltino di Colalto, and she poured her heart into every carefully crafted line. The performance began beautifully. Gaspara's voice, clear and sweet, floated through the candlelit chamber like incense. Her lute accompaniment provided a perfect counterpoint to the melancholy lyrics. The audience was clearly moved, leaning forward in their chairs, absorbed in the emotional intensity of her words. But as she reached the poem's climactic moment, the verse where she compared her beloved's indifference to winter frost, Gaspara's voice cracked. Not a small, easily overlooked crack, but a spectacular vocal failure that turned her carefully rehearsed crescendo into what sounded rather like a startled goose. The silence that followed was deafening. Gaspara stood frozen, her lute still humming with the last chord, while her audience struggled to maintain their composure. One elderly gentleman, clearly trying to be kind, began to applaud, but the sound only emphasized the awkwardness of the moment. What followed was a lesson in the graceful handling of artistic disaster. Gaspara set down her lute, smiled ruefully, and addressed her audience with perfect honesty. "It seems," she said, "that my heart wishes to speak of love in ways that my voice cannot manage this evening. Perhaps passion is best expressed in whispers rather than songs." The audience, charmed by her candor and grace, responded with warm applause. The evening continued with other entertainments, but many guests later remarked that Gaspara's moment of vulnerability had been more moving than any perfect performance could have been. It reminded them that behind the polished exterior of a Renaissance courtesan was a woman with hopes, fears, and an occasionally rebellious voice. Let yourself sink deeper into these stories, and if you're still listening, perhaps share this gentle journey with someone who needs a little rest tonight. The world of Renaissance courtesans was highly stratified, with complex hierarchies based on beauty, wit, connections, and social skills. Navigating this world required an almost encyclopedic knowledge of who was important, who was rising, who was falling, and who must never, under any circumstances, be seated next to whom at dinner. This social complexity created endless opportunities for mortifying mistakes, as Bianca Capello discovered during her early days in Florence. Bianca, who would eventually become the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, began her career as a relatively minor courtesan, still learning the intricate protocols of court life. The incident occurred during a reception at the Palazzo Pitti in 1563. Bianca, eager to make a good impression, had spent considerable time studying the genealogies and current standings of the various noble families who would be in attendance. She felt confident in her ability to navigate the social currents, having memorized a detailed mental map of who was related to whom, and more importantly, who was currently feuding with whom. But as often happens when one is trying too hard to appear sophisticated, Bianca's careful preparation led to spectacular confusion. Upon being introduced to Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, she launched into an enthusiastic conversation about his wonderful work with the orphanages of Rome, praising his charitable nature and spiritual dedication. The problem, as she realized with growing horror, was that she was thinking of an entirely different Giovanni de' Medici. The man standing before her, while bearing the same illustrious name, was actually a military commander known primarily for his decidedly unclerical lifestyle and his impressive collection of mistresses. The cardinal, to his credit, listened to her praise of his supposed piety with increasing amusement, occasionally raising an eyebrow as she described his angelic devotion to the poor. When she finished, he smiled and suggested that she might be thinking of someone else, as he had never been accused of excessive spirituality. Bianca, realizing her error, felt her face burning with embarrassment, but the cardinal, rather than leaving her to suffer in her mortification, began to regale her with stories of his actual adventures, which were considerably more colorful than any charitable work. By the end of the evening, they had become genuine friends, and he would later prove instrumental in her eventual rise to power. Behind the silk and sophistication of courtesan life lay some decidedly unromantic realities. These women were essentially running sophisticated businesses, managing households, negotiating contracts, and dealing with the same financial pressures that challenge any entrepreneur. The collision between these practical concerns and their carefully maintained images of effortless grace led to some wonderfully human moments. Veronica Franco, whose earlier mishap with her headdress we witnessed, also left us detailed records of her household accounts. These ledgers, preserved in the Venetian archives, reveal a woman constantly juggling expenses, investments, and the costs of maintaining her luxurious lifestyle. One particularly revealing entry from 1582 details a month when everything seemed to go wrong at once. Her principal patron had been called away to Rome on church business, leaving her without her primary source of income. At the same time, her palazzo's roof began leaking during Venice's notoriously damp spring season, threatening her expensive furnishings and artwork. But perhaps most mortifying of all, her cook had accidentally destroyed an entire service of Venetian glass during a dinner party, sending her scrambling to replace it before her next important gathering. The replacement cost, as she calculated mournfully in her ledger, was equivalent to a month's rent for a middle-class family. Veronica's solution reveals both her practical nature and her occasionally awkward relationship with money. Rather than cancel her social obligations, she decided to host a series of intimate poetry readings, charging admission under the guise of supporting literary arts. Her friends, understanding the delicate fiction, attended enthusiastically, but the pretense led to some amusing moments. At one such gathering, a wealthy merchant, perhaps not entirely understanding the arrangement, loudly praised Veronica for her charitable support of struggling poets, while waiving his admission ticket. The real poets in attendance, who were actually being paid for their performances, exchanged bemused glances as Veronica tried to maintain her gracious smile. The evening was saved when one quick-witted poet, understanding the situation, began an impromptu verse about the beautiful generosity that flows like water through marble palaces. The metaphor, while somewhat tortured, allowed everyone to maintain their dignity while acknowledging the economic realities underlying their elegant gathering. Renaissance courtesans were students of human nature, masters of psychology centuries before the field officially existed. They studied the subtle arts of conversation, the strategic deployment of flattery, and the delicate balance between availability and mystery. But like all students, they sometimes miscalculated spectacularly. Laura Battiferri, a courtesan and poet of Florence, once spent months preparing for what she hoped would be the seduction of a prominent banker who had recently arrived from Genoa. She researched his interests, his business concerns, even his hometown's history and customs. She planned conversations that would showcase her intelligence while flattering his expertise. She arranged musical entertainments featuring Genoese folk songs. She even learned to prepare several Ligurian delicacies. The evening of their first private dinner was choreographed like a military campaign. Every candle placed with precision, every course timed to perfection, every conversational topic rehearsed until it seemed spontaneous. Laura felt confident that her preparation would surely win over this cultured and wealthy potential patron. But as the evening unfolded, Laura gradually realized that something was terribly wrong. Her carefully chosen topics of conversation were met with polite but puzzled responses. Her Genoese songs seemed to confuse rather than charm her guest. Her lovingly prepared regional dishes prompted more curiosity than appreciation. The awful truth emerged over dessert, when her guest casually mentioned that he had actually been born in Milan and had never lived in Genoa at all. Laura had spent months researching the wrong man, confusing her intended target with another banker entirely. Her elaborate cultural tribute to his non-existent Genoese heritage had left him thoroughly bewildered. Rather than continuing the charade, Laura decided to confess her error. She explained her research, her preparations, and her mortifying mistake. To her surprise, the banker found her dedication charming rather than absurd. He was impressed by the thoroughness of her preparation, even if it had been misdirected, and amused by her willingness to admit her error rather than bluff through the evening. They spent the rest of the night laughing about mistaken identities and the perils of preparation. The banker became one of her most faithful patrons, though he never let her forget the night she tried to seduce him with the wrong man's biography. Feel yourself relaxing deeper, letting these gentle stories wash over you like gentle waves. And if you're still with me, feel free to subscribe or share this with someone who struggles to sleep. Physical beauty was undeniably important in the world of Renaissance courtesans, but maintaining that beauty required constant vigilance, elaborate routines, and occasionally hazardous experiments with the cosmetics and treatments of the era. The gap between the ideal of effortless beauty and the messy reality of achieving it led to some delightfully awkward moments. Imperia de Sanctis, considered one of the most beautiful women in Rome during the early 1500s, was famous for her porcelain complexion and luminous skin. What her admirers didn't know was that achieving this ethereal look required a daily routine that would challenge a modern spa. Imperia's beauty regimen began before dawn with a mixture of crushed pearls, rosewater, and what her beauty manual delicately referred to as purified mercury. The mercury, we now know, was gradually poisoning her. But 16th century beauty standards demanded sacrifices that modern science would find appalling. One morning, as she prepared for a crucial meeting with Cardinal de' Medici, Imperia's elaborate beauty routine went spectacularly awry. Her maid, perhaps distracted or simply inexperienced, had prepared the face powder with an incorrect ratio of ingredients. Instead of the subtle, luminous glow that was Imperia's signature, the mixture turned her skin a rather startling shade of pale blue. The effect was dramatic. Imperia looked rather like an expensive marble statue, beautiful in its way, but decidedly unnatural. With Cardinal de' Medici expected within the hour, and no time to completely redo her preparations, Imperia faced a crisis that tested all her creative problem-solving skills. Her solution was characteristically bold. Rather than attempt to remove the blue-tinged powder, she decided to embrace the otherworldly effect. She had her maid add silver dust to her hair, draped herself in white silk, and when the cardinal arrived, she greeted him as if she were a living artwork, a meditation on celestial beauty. The cardinal, a sophisticated patron of the arts, was initially startled, but then delighted by this unexpected artistic presentation. He spent the afternoon discussing Neoplatonic philosophy and the relationship between earthly and divine beauty, treating Imperia's cosmetic disaster as if it were a carefully planned performance piece. The story might have ended there, except that the silver dust in her hair, combined with the heat of the Roman afternoon, began to create an unfortunate chemical reaction. By evening, Imperia's elaborate coiffure was literally smoking, producing small puffs of acrid vapor that made her eyes water. The cardinal, noticing her distress, gallantly suggested that they move their philosophical discussion to the garden, where the divine vapors of her celestial transformation could ascend more freely toward heaven. His diplomatic phrasing allowed Imperia to escape to her chambers, where she spent the next hour frantically washing experimental cosmetics out of her hair. Many Renaissance courtesans were accomplished writers, producing poetry, letters, and philosophical treatises that survive to this day. But writing, especially writing about love and desire, required navigating the complex literary conventions of the era. Mistakes in tone, style, or classical reference could transform a sophisticated love poem into an unintentional comedy. Gaspara Stampa, whom we met earlier during her vocal disaster, also experienced the literary equivalent when she attempted to write an epic poem comparing her beloved to various classical heroes. The poem, intended as a serious work of literary art, unfortunately revealed some significant gaps in her classical education. The work began promisingly, with elaborate comparisons between her lover and Achilles, Paris, and other figures from Greek mythology. But as the poem continued, Gaspara's grasp of classical details became increasingly creative. She described Odysseus's famous victory over the Cyclops with his mighty sword, apparently unaware that the hero had actually used cunning rather than martial prowess to escape Polyphemus. More problematically, she confused several different mythological traditions, creating a narrative in which Aeneas, Theseus, and Jason appeared to be contemporaries engaged in a complex love triangle involving both Helen of Troy and Penelope. The chronological impossibilities mounted with each stanza, creating an epic that read more like mythological fan fiction than serious literature. The poem's climax, in which she compared her beloved's departure to Orpheus's triumphant rescue of Eurydice, revealed that she had either misremembered or never properly learned one of the most famous tragic endings in all of classical literature. When Gaspara shared the completed work with her literary circle, the response was diplomatically mixed. Her friends praised her passion and linguistic skill while carefully avoiding any mention of the mythological confusion that formed the poem's foundation. But one young scholar, perhaps not understanding the social delicacy of the situation, began to offer corrections, starting with a gentle suggestion that Orpheus had actually failed to rescue Eurydice. This led to an increasingly awkward conversation as other factual errors were identified, until Gaspara realized that her epic poem had become an unintentional catalogue of classical misconceptions. Rather than abandoning the work in embarrassment, Gaspara decided to reframe it as an experimental piece, arguing that she was deliberately liberating mythology from the constraints of historical accuracy. This creative interpretation, while somewhat transparent, allowed her to maintain her literary reputation while quietly studying classical texts more carefully before her next poetic venture. Renaissance courtesans often served as informal ambassadors, hosting foreign dignitaries, facilitating delicate negotiations, and helping to maintain the complex web of alliances that kept Italian city-states from constant warfare. This diplomatic role required exquisite social skills and cultural sensitivity, which made public mistakes all the more mortifying. Virginia de' Medici, a distant cousin of the famous banking family, found herself in this position during the tense summer of 1571. Relations between Venice and Florence had been strained by competing trade interests, and Virginia had been asked to host a series of informal dinners designed to ease tensions between representatives of the two cities. The challenge was immense. Venetian and Florentine customs, while both Italian, differed in subtle but important ways. Table manners, conversational etiquette, even the proper way to offer wine, all varied between the two cultures. Virginia spent weeks preparing, consulting with diplomats, studying cultural guides, and rehearsing appropriate responses to various scenarios. The first dinner seemed to be proceeding smoothly. The Venetian ambassador was charming, the Florentine merchant families were on their best behavior, and Virginia felt confident that her careful preparation was paying off. The conversation flowed easily between topics of mutual interest, art, trade, and the weather. But as the evening progressed, Virginia began to notice subtle signs of tension. The Venetians seemed slightly uncomfortable, exchanging glances when they thought no one was looking. The Florentines, meanwhile, appeared increasingly puzzled by something, though they were too polite to mention it directly. The source of the confusion gradually became clear. Virginia had indeed studied both cultures carefully, but in her anxiety to accommodate everyone, she had mixed up several crucial customs. She was serving wine in the Venetian style while offering food in the Florentine manner, creating a hybrid etiquette that satisfied neither group while confusing both. More problematically, her attempts to demonstrate cultural sensitivity had led to some unfortunate linguistic choices. She was using Venetian dialect when addressing the Florentines and Tuscan phrases when speaking to the Venetians. The effect was rather like someone trying to compliment a French guest in German while serving them English tea with Japanese ceremony. The evening's nadir came when Virginia, attempting to offer a toast that would honor both cities, accidentally used a Venetian phrase that, while perfectly polite in Venice, had rather different connotations in Florentine dialect. The resulting silence was profound, broken only by the gentle crackling of candles and the distant sound of gondoliers on the canal. Salvation came from an unexpected source. The Venetian ambassador, recognizing Virginia's good intentions despite her cultural confusion, began to laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation for the complexity of her task. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we should create entirely new customs tonight, ones that belong neither to Venice nor Florence, but to the International Republic of Friendship." The suggestion was embraced enthusiastically by all present. The remainder of the evening was spent inventing ridiculous new customs, creating hybrid toasts, and generally celebrating the beautiful absurdity of diplomatic protocol. Virginia's cultural disaster had inadvertently broken down the formal barriers between the two groups, leading to more genuine friendship than any perfectly executed dinner might have achieved. Clothing in Renaissance Italy was a language unto itself, conveying social status, political allegiances, and personal taste through every fold, color, and accessory. For courtesans, whose appearance was both professional tool and personal expression, fashion choices carried enormous weight, which made fashion disasters all the more spectacular. Giulia d'Aragona, the philosopher courtesan we met earlier, was known for her intellectual sophistication and her impeccable taste in dress. She favored rich but understated fabrics, elegant lines, and accessories that suggested wealth without vulgarity. Her style was much admired and frequently copied by other women of her social circle. But fashion, especially Renaissance fashion, with its complex structural undergarments and intricate fastenings, was a precarious business. This fact was brought home to Giulia during a particularly important philosophical debate at the Accademia Romana. She had been invited to present her treatise on the nature of love to an audience of distinguished scholars, a tremendous honor that required her most serious and dignified appearance. Giulia had chosen her outfit carefully, a gown of deep blue silk with understated gold embroidery, worn over the elaborate foundation garments that created the distinctive silhouette of 16th century fashion. The ensemble was completed with a headdress of moderate height and a selection of jewelry that suggested prosperity without ostentation. The presentation began well. Giulia's arguments were clear and compelling, her command of philosophical terminology impressive, her ability to engage with complex questions evident to all present. The audience was respectfully attentive, occasionally nodding approval as she developed particularly elegant points. But Renaissance undergarments, while creating beautiful silhouettes, were held in place by an intricate system of laces, stays, and pins that could fail catastrophically under stress. Midway through a particularly passionate argument about the distinction between physical and spiritual desire, Tullia's bodice decided to stage its own philosophical rebellion. The structural failure was gradual at first, a slight shift, a small gap, the kind of thing that might have gone unnoticed in a less formal setting. But as Tullia continued speaking, gesturing to emphasize her points, the situation became increasingly precarious. She found herself trying to make sophisticated arguments about platonic love while simultaneously attempting to hold her dress together through sheer force of will. The audience, being scholars and gentlemen, maintained perfect composure, though several were clearly struggling not to smile. Tullia, realizing that her philosophical credibility was quite literally coming undone, faced a choice between abandoning her presentation or continuing while steadily losing her clothing. Her solution was characteristically intellectual. She paused, looked down at her rebellious bodice, and declared that she was experiencing a metaphysical demonstration of the soul's desire to escape the constraints of material existence. The audience, delighted by this creative interpretation, applauded enthusiastically while Tullia made a dignified retreat to address her wardrobe malfunction. She returned 20 minutes later, properly secured, and completed her presentation to great acclaim. But the incident became legendary in Roman intellectual circles, not as an embarrassment, but as an example of how a truly philosophical mind could find meaning in even the most awkward circumstances. Renaissance education placed enormous emphasis on memory. Students were trained to retain vast amounts of information using elaborate mnemonic systems. Classical rhetoric demanded the ability to recall complex arguments, poetry, and quotations at will. For courtesans, whose conversations needed to demonstrate both wit and learning, a good memory was essential, which made memory failures particularly mortifying. Veronica Gambara, a courtesan and poet from Brescia, prided herself on her ability to quote classical authors at length. Her salon was famous for literary conversations where participants would cap each other's quotations, building elaborate verbal structures from half-remembered verses and philosophical fragments. On one memorable evening, Veronica attempted to demonstrate her classical learning by reciting what she claimed was an extensive passage from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The quotation began accurately enough, but as she continued, her memory began to drift. Incorporating fragments from other authors, half-remembered lines from contemporary poets, and eventually passages that seemed to exist nowhere but in her own imagination. The audience, initially impressed by her apparent recall, gradually became puzzled as the quotation developed in increasingly unlikely directions. Ovid's elegant Latin seemed to be mixing with Dante's Italian, while incorporating what sounded suspiciously like contemporary Venetian slang. Veronica, swept up in the rhythm of her own performance, didn't notice the growing confusion among her listeners. She continued with increasing confidence, even adding dramatic gestures to emphasize particularly beautiful passages, completely unaware that she was essentially performing an elaborate work of accidental poetry. The moment of realization came when one guest, a genuine classical scholar, gently inquired about which manuscript tradition she was quoting from, as he was unfamiliar with several passages. Veronica, suddenly aware that her memory had been taking considerable creative liberties, found herself in the awkward position of having to explain that she had somehow been making up classical literature as she went along. Rather than collapsing in embarrassment, Veronica decided to embrace the situation. She declared that she had been experimenting with creative scholarship, blending classical and contemporary sources to create new forms of literary expression. The explanation was somewhat transparent, but her audience, charmed by her inventiveness and honesty, chose to play along. The evening evolved into an impromptu game, with guests taking turns creating their own classical quotations. The results were often more entertaining than actual ancient literature, and Veronica's memory lapse became the foundation for a new form of literary entertainment that was copied in salons throughout northern Italy. Let yourself sink even deeper into rest now, these voices from centuries past carrying you gently towards sleep. If you're finding peace here, perhaps subscribe or simply drift away. The relationship between courtesans and their patrons was complex, involving genuine affection, calculated strategy, and the awkward reality of economic dependence. Managing these relationships required enormous emotional intelligence, but even the most sophisticated women sometimes found themselves in situations where the collision between feeling and finance created uncomfortable moments. Isabella di Luna, whom we met earlier during her tomato disaster, experienced one such moment when her primary patron, a wealthy Neapolitan merchant named Francesco Sanseverino, decided to surprise her with an elaborate gift. The gesture was meant to be romantic, but the practical implications created an awkward social situation that tested all of Isabella's diplomatic skills. Francesco, in a burst of generosity, had commissioned a portrait of Isabella from one of Naples' most fashionable artists. The painting itself was beautiful, showing Isabella in an elaborate gown of blue and gold, surrounded by symbols of learning and virtue. It was clearly expensive, expertly executed, and intended as a tribute to her beauty and accomplishments. The problem was the inscription. Francesco, overcome with romantic enthusiasm, had instructed the artist to include a Latin motto proclaiming Isabella to be the Venus of Naples, beloved of Francesco Sanseverino, patron of arts and beauty. The inscription was prominently displayed on a cartouche at the bottom of the painting, making Francesco's patronage, and by implication, the nature of their relationship, publicly explicit. For Isabella, the painting created a delicate social problem. While she was touched by Francesco's devotion, the explicit inscription made it impossible to display the portrait without advertising the financial basis of their relationship. Yet refusing such an expensive and carefully commissioned gift would deeply offend her patron and potentially end their arrangement. Isabella's solution required considerable creativity. She accepted the painting with appropriate gratitude, but explained that its beauty was so overwhelming that she felt compelled to display it only in her most private chambers, where she could contemplate its splendor without distraction. This allowed her to honor Francesco's gift while avoiding public display of the problematic inscription. But Francesco, proud of his commissioned artwork, kept asking when Isabella planned to hang the portrait in her main salon, where his friends and business associates could admire his good taste. Each inquiry required a new excuse, creating an increasingly elaborate fiction about the painting's supposed spiritual power and the need for contemplative privacy. The situation reached its climax during a dinner party when Francesco, perhaps influenced by wine, began describing the portrait in detail to his friends, building up to what was clearly intended to be a dramatic unveiling. Isabella, realizing that her careful diplomatic balance was about to collapse, had to think quickly. Her solution was to claim that the painting had become an object of such personal devotion that she had decided to donate it to a convent, where it could serve as an inspiration for holy contemplation. The story was obviously fictional, but it allowed Francesco to feel proud of his gift's supposed spiritual impact while gracefully ending his requests for public display. Renaissance culture valued emotional expression, but within carefully prescribed boundaries. Courtesans were expected to be passionate but not overwhelming, vulnerable but not weak, sensitive but not unstable. Navigating these expectations required perfect timing and exquisite judgment, which made emotional miscalculations particularly awkward. Francesca Baffo, a Venetian courtesan known for her dramatic flair and artistic sensibility, learned this lesson during what should have been her moment of triumph. She had been invited to perform at a private concert for the Doge himself, an honor that represented the pinnacle of social recognition in Venice. Francesca had prepared extensively, choosing a particularly moving madrigal about lost love. She had rehearsed not just the music, but the emotional arc of the performance, calculating exactly when to let her voice break with feeling, when to allow tears to glisten in her eyes, when to pause for dramatic effect. The performance began beautifully. Her voice soared through the ornate chamber, her emotional timing seemed perfect, and the distinguished audience was clearly moved by her artistry. But as she reached the song's climactic moment, where she had planned to display her most affecting vulnerability, disaster struck. Rather than the single, perfectly placed tear she had rehearsed, Francesca found herself overwhelmed by genuine emotion. Perhaps it was the pressure of performing for the Doge. Perhaps the song's lyrics had touched something real in her own experience. But whatever the cause, her careful emotional control abandoned her completely. What followed was not the elegant display of sensitivity she had planned, but a full-scale breakdown. Tears streamed down her carefully painted face. Her voice cracked and wavered, and she found herself sobbing uncontrollably in front of Venice's most powerful man and his assembled court. The silence that followed was profound. The Doge, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected display, sat motionless while his courtiers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Francesca, realizing that her artistic triumph had become a social disaster, stood frozen, her lute still clutched in her trembling hands. Salvation came from an unexpected source. The Doge's elderly mother, who had been watching from a corner of the room, rose from her chair and approached the distraught performer. "My dear," she said gently, "only someone who has truly loved could sing of loss with such honesty. Your tears honor the music more than perfect technique ever could." The old woman's words transformed the moment. What had seemed like professional catastrophe became artistic authenticity. The court, taking their cue from the Doge's mother, responded with warm applause, treating Francesca's breakdown as evidence of her deep artistic sensitivity rather than lack of professional control. Francesca learned to incorporate this lesson into her future performances, allowing genuine emotion to inform her art while maintaining enough control to avoid complete collapse. But she never forgot the night when her carefully rehearsed vulnerability was replaced by something far more real and ultimately more powerful. Let these gentle voices from long ago carry you deeper into peaceful rest. If you're still listening, perhaps share this quiet journey with someone who needs a little sleep tonight. The pursuit of beauty in Renaissance Italy often involved experiments with cosmetics and treatments that would horrify modern chemists. Courtesans, whose appearance was central to their success, were often early adopters of new beauty techniques, sometimes with spectacular and mortifying results. Laura Dianti, mistress to Alfonso Fer d'Este and one of the most admired beauties of Ferrara, became an unwitting pioneer in cosmetic chemistry when she decided to experiment with a new hair treatment, promised to create lustrous, golden locks that would rival those of the famous Venetian beauties. The treatment, recommended by a visiting alchemist who claimed to have learned the secrets from Byzantine masters, involved a complex mixture of sulfur, quicklime, and various plant extracts. The process required several hours of careful application, followed by exposure to sunlight to activate the golden properties of the mixture. Laura, eager to achieve the legendary golden hair that poets celebrated in their verses, submitted to the lengthy procedure. The alchemist applied his concoction with great ceremony, wrapping her hair in specially prepared cloths and arranging her to sit in a sunny courtyard while the treatment worked its supposed magic. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. Laura sat patiently in the garden, reading poetry and enjoying the spring sunshine, while her hair absorbed what she hoped would be transformative beauty treatments. The alchemist bustled about, making mysterious adjustments and consulting astrological charts to determine the optimal exposure time. But chemical reactions, even in the Renaissance, follow their own laws, regardless of human intentions. The sulfur and lime, activated by heat and moisture, began producing effects that had nothing to do with golden beauty. Laura's first indication of trouble came as a distinctly unpleasant smell, followed by an alarming sensation of heat on her scalp. By the time she realized something was seriously wrong, the chemical reaction was well advanced. Her hair, rather than turning golden, had begun dissolving. The supposedly transformative treatment was literally eating through her carefully maintained locks, leaving her with patches of chemical burns and significantly less hair than she had started with. The alchemist, faced with the obvious failure of his treatment, quickly packed his equipment and departed, muttering about unfavorable planetary alignments and insufficiently purified ingredients. Laura was left to face the social implications of her chemical catastrophe. Her solution required both creativity and considerable humor. Rather than attempting to hide her altered appearance, Laura decided to embrace it as a bold fashion statement. She commissioned a series of elaborate headdresses and veils, claiming that she was pioneering a new style that emphasized the beauty of the face rather than the distraction of hair. The style, supported by Laura's confidence and social position, actually became fashionable among certain circles in Ferrara. What had begun as a cosmetic disaster evolved into a trend that lasted several seasons. Laura's chemical mishap had accidentally established her as a fashion innovator rather than a victim of pseudoscience. And so, as the candles burn low in these Renaissance palaces, as the last echoes of laughter fade from marble halls, as silk rustles softly in chambers where these remarkable women once lived and loved and stumbled through their gloriously human lives, we come to the end of our quiet journey together. These stories, preserved in letters and diaries, in the margins of history books, in the whispered memories passed down through generations, remind us that beneath the elaborate gowns and careful facades, behind the poetry and philosophy and political maneuvering, lived women who faced the same delightful, mortifying, wonderfully human moments that we all recognize. They dropped their headdresses at crucial moments. They forgot their lines. They confused their classical references. They served disastrous dinners. They fell victim to experimental cosmetics. They miscalculated in matters of the heart. And through it all, they maintained their grace, their humor, their essential humanity. Perhaps that's the real secret we've uncovered tonight. Not the scandals or intrigues that history often emphasizes, but the simple, beautiful truth that elegance and awkwardness, sophistication and embarrassment, wisdom and confusion can coexist in the same person, in the same moment, in the same life. These women, in their moments of graceful disaster, teach us something important about resilience, about humor, about the art of transforming mishap into opportunity. They show us that true sophistication lies not in avoiding mistakes, but in handling them with style, wit, and genuine human warmth. As you drift towards sleep now, let their voices carry you gently into dreams. Let their laughter echo softly in your mind. Their grace inspire your own moments of uncertainty. Their humanity remind you that we are all, in our various ways, stumbling beautifully through our lives, doing our best to maintain our composure while the world presents us with unexpected challenges. If these gentle stories have brought you peace tonight, if you found comfort in these whispers from the past, perhaps you'll share this quiet journey with someone else who needs a little rest, a little perspective, a little reminder that we're all more human than we sometimes remember. And if you're still with me as these last words fade into silence, as you settle deeper into the embrace of approaching sleep, know that somewhere across the centuries, in candle-lit chambers and marble halls, these remarkable women are still laughing softly at their own beautiful awkwardness, still teaching us through their preserved moments of mortification that grace and humor can transform any disaster into a story worth remembering. Sweet dreams, gentle listener. Let history's whispers carry you safely through the night until morning brings new opportunities for your own perfectly imperfect human adventures. Sleep well.